Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I see I'm really burned out up here, but that's the way it is. Uh, uh, I've chosen to write out what I have to say today, so I would be to the point and not ramble, and also because I could send it to Skylar later on, and you could have it for your records or for the future. I also took the liberty of going back a little bit to cover some of the history that you just spoke about, to connect it to the time that I was here. And so the other thing that you should know is that I severely sprained my ankle a couple of days ago. So I'm under the influence of drugs, which is kind of nice, but it does make me a little less articulate and stentorian than I might otherwise be. So if I stumble a little bit, it's the drugs talking, the painkillers talking, and not me, okay? So the title of this is I'm a Soul Man. When people ask me what it was like being minister here in the 1990s, I often reply, to me, Seinfeld was a documentary. Jerry's mythical apartment was only a few blocks away. Many of its characters could well have been members. For a few years, we organized the Memorial Day weekend retreat at an Episcopal retreat center in Connecticut. One of our activities was to break into groups of 5 or 6 and create skits to present to the others. Many of the skits were ridiculously good. They might have been pilots for sitcoms. Eventually, we passed a rule that no group could have more than 2 people who were member of the Screen Actors Guild. Our small choir was likewise so peppered with professionals, we could have called them the Ringers. Our congregation was composed primarily of actors and therapists, or so it seemed. To say it was an interesting mix is a vast understatement. We were a vibrant, welcoming, inclusive group, and our church school grew, bringing in more and more children and families. We provided the families with a sense of community and the singles with a sense of family. We were involved in an array of UU activisms. The Gay Women's Alliance had been meeting at Fourth U going back to the 50s, when we were the only place that would welcome them. We hosted animal rights events and large pagan gatherings, especially on the winter solstice. We welcomed Native American teach-ins and offered free meeting space to Native American activist groups. We had an AIDS memorial service every year beginning well before I arrived. There were a lot of flowers at those Sundays, always paid for by Jim Kelly. He was a commercial real estate agent in the village and also an artist, a painter. He once told me, when I am a real estate agent, I am way in the closet. When I am an artist, I'm way out. Here at Fourth U is really the only place I can be myself. This statement shows the best of what Fourth U meant to its members and the community. In about my second or third year, Jim changed this from a memorial service to a Pride Day celebration. This was a happy day. We never did, however, get with the anti-racism program of the UUA, though a few of us struggled mightily to do so. This was not unusual for UU anywhere at that time, as good white liberals who knew as an act of faith that they were not racist did not respond well to their first encounter with concepts like white skin privilege and institutional racism. This was beyond disappointing to many of us. It shows the strength of UU values that our congregations can be so helpful to the larger community while being so dysfunctional in their organization. The same openness that created a vibrant community also lacked a structure and boundaries that made coherent administration impossible. When people ask me how I fared at Fourth U, I often quote Yankee Reggie Jackson. Keep in mind that Jackson was a very successful star in New York, yet he said, "They put scars on you there." My scars came almost exclusively from trying to manage an organization comprised of a small, wild congregation knocking around a gigantic antique building that could not come close to maintaining itself without massive amounts of outside money and expertise. Soul, Save Our Universalist Landmark, began when a neighbor noticed the church's crumbling front steps and mentioned that his condo might be willing to raise some money to fix it. Since you have had a second round of Soul, I suspect you are somewhat familiar with Soul's impact on the congregation and also on the landmarking of religious buildings throughout the city and even the nation. The details of that would be a long session in itself. How did a once wealthy church become an ecclesiastical Miss Havisham. Congregations of all flavors are often more at the mercy of their immediate neighborhoods for growth or decline than anything they do or fail to do themselves. When the automobile became ascendant, it was no longer necessary to live in the city to work in the city. Many Fourth U members moved to the suburbs and were not replaced. Thus began a decline of the Upper West Side that did not abate until the Uber gentrification called Lincoln Center. Internal machinations, however, also make a difference. In 1919, Reverend Frank Oliver Hall left Fourth U after a very successful ministry, which began in 1902. You may have already covered this, but it is my understanding that he left because a small number of influential members, including an owner of a company that manufactured American flags, objected to Reverend Hall's opposition to World War I. Hall took a position with the AUA and created the Social Justice Department there, which was later grafted onto the UUA. What the congregation learned then, and it is not a good thing for a congregation to learn, is that a small cabal of members can band together to get rid of a minister. Hall was followed by Joseph Fort Newton, who was Episcopalian and a famous one at that. He was also a very active Freemason whose booklet on Masonry became one of the fundamental texts of the group. In his autobiography, he writes nothing about his time at Fourth U other than to state, the less said, the better. Hall returned for a second term from 1929 to 38. One assumes there was more agreement about how to deal with the Depression than the war. 3 years after his departure, there were a series of 2-year ministries that lasted from 1941 to 1968. This interval is central to understanding the subsequent history of Fourth U. These were all what we would now call contract ministries. That is, they were limited to 2 years, and the minister was hired by the board rather than called by the congregation. This instituted that a small number of members would be making all the decisions, and the minister's vision was limited to what the board could see. This may very well have been the only way the congregation could have survived World War II and the depressed and dangerous neighborhood that the Upper West Side had become. Reverend Farley Wheelwright, who had a long and distinguished ministry, told me he applied for one of those contract ministries in the early 1950s. One of his ideas to make the church more useful to the community was to open the gym to neighborhood kids, which at that time would have meant a lot of Black kids. He was met with cold disdain, and he knew immediately his interview was over. In the early 70s, the congregation had run out of the last of the wealthy families that supported the church because their grandfathers did. Fourth U is the only church of the 5 I serve that had no birthright members. In 1968, the congregation called, rather than hired, a minister for the first time in 28 years. Reverend Richard Calloway instituted the singles groups of the 70s that financed the church until that fad faded in the 80s. There would be 300 people for the singles groups on Saturday and 20 attending Sunday worship. The board continued to act as though the minister worked for them. Reverend Calloway, when I told him I was going to candidate at Fourth U, said, "I wouldn't wish that congregation on anyone." Strangely enough, I took that as a challenge, which I think is what he hoped I would do. The next settled minister, Reverend Joel Schofield, rode the singles group elevator to the ground floor and departed for a church in California. Reverend Joyce Smith had been the director of the UUA Department of Ministry when she was called in 1985 to last fewer than 3 years. Part of the reason was that she was really not at home in New York City, and partly because she was appalled at the level of institutional service, though she would never have used that word, which was part of her difficulty here. When I arrived, this congregation was widely considered the most difficult in the UUA. I was chosen partly because I had some experience and interest in historic preservation, having served one of the old first parishes outside Boston. By this time, Seoul was well underway. I was impressed with what was and still is one of the most successful approaches to historic preservation of religious properties ever created. My job was to spend the money. We hired a director of management and marketing who created the landmark On the Park brand. Soon our operating budget was 80% from rentals. While this enabled the congregation to survive in its muddy pit of a building, it also maintained the dependency of the congregation. They once were financed by a few rich families who ran the board and made all the decisions. Now the building those families had built was doing the financing. On one level, this enabled the congregation to be free of real governance responsibility, but it also kept them administratively infantilized. They had no capacity to address issues as a congregation, delegating them to board members who either burned out quickly or worse, enjoyed the power. When I returned from sabbatical in 1996, I was unable to reconnect. The congregation was getting a little tired of me and vice versa. It happens. Better to leave than stoke a fire after the ashes cool. My time at Fourth U was among the most memorable of my life, and I am most grateful for the experience. I have several hours more on this topic should someone be interested. I love my time in New York, scars and all.
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see you all, even in the chat. I was really happy to be asked to come and talk about my time at Fourth U. It's been a while. I have had, 7 years to reflect. I don't have anything written. I'm just going to talk because I wanted to, I kind of made notes for myself about the things that were most important for me to remember. The most important thing for me to remember is September 11th, 2001. And the ways in which that shaped my ministry at Fourth U and the congregation to a large degree. I was called to the church in 2001. We moved into the parsonage around August 15th, my husband and myself and our 2 children, Alan and Daniel, who at the time were 8 and 4.5. And I preached my first sermon in the congregation on September 9th, 2001, and was well received. I had a really warm welcome. The congregation was small, but friendly. There were tensions, nonetheless, because of a variety of conflicts among different social justice groups within the congregation. And that would be an ongoing theme at the church. But at the time, it was my first Sunday and all was well. And I went home and I took Monday off and I expected to come in on Tuesday and finish unpacking my books and start thinking about my sermon and walk around the building and familiarize myself with this gigantic hulk of a building. But that's not what happened. My husband had taken the kids to school to let me sleep late, but then all the phones started ringing. The cell phone rang, the house phone rang. When the house phone rang, it was my sister in Chicago asking if I was all right because she didn't know much about New York and she didn't know where we were. The cell phone was my husband, Bob, who was at his office and asking me how the kids were. And I didn't really understand what had happened. And he said, turn on the television. And I turned on the television in time to see the second tower fall. And the radio talked about the fact that they were getting bomb threats at schools. And I told my sister I'd call her back, that I was fine. I told Bob I was on my way to get the kids. And I jumped on what it turned out to be one of the last buses that were running down Columbus Avenue. The parsonage is on 100th Street. I jumped on the Columbus Avenue bus downtown, got to PS 87, where my children were enrolled. Daniel was in kindergarten, Alan was in 3rd grade. And they met us at the door and said, we need the names of your children. We're not allowing parents up there. And please don't talk about what's happened because there are kids whose parents work in the towers. So I got the kids and I was walking back to the church with them. And I got on Columbus Avenue and I said, well, I need to tell you guys about what happened at the towers today, at the Twin Towers. And Daniel, my little one, said, oh, Mama, the towers fell down today. And I said, how did you know that? And he said, I heard it on the playground. So we got to the church and some of the staff was closing up the church. And I said, no, we have to open the church. We can't close the church. People are going to be coming and everybody's going to be upset. So there was a school that rented the parish house, and they brought us some of the water that they had. The Starbucks on 76 and Columbus came and brought food because they were closing. Everything was closing. And all I could think of was, where are people going to go to the bathroom? Where are people going to rest? People are going to be upset. We need to be at church today. So staff brought tables out. We brought chairs out. We opened the doors. And before long, there were just an army of people walking because there was no other way to get around. There were no buses, no trains, no cars, nothing, no taxis. All you heard were feet and F-16s flying overhead. And so people began to come to the church. Members of the church came, especially members who were single, who lived alone, because they didn't want to be alone. They wanted to be at the church. And so we were open, I guess, 12 hours a day for the next 3 weeks. People were coming to light candles, to pray, to cry. We did a vigil that night. I told Bob to come and get the kids because I didn't know what time I was going to be home. And so I spent the next few weeks either at our church or later in October, I became a chaplain at Ground Zero. I went to the board and said that I thought that it was important that people who were in the city help downtown, especially because the chaplains were pulling out from different parts of the country. There were chaplains coming from everywhere. And they were getting ready to go home. And a student at Star King, curiously enough, had come with the Oklahoma City chaplains, and I had posted that I couldn't manage to find anybody who could help me get down there. And she said for me to meet her at Fulton and Broadway the next day, and I did that, and she got me through the gate and into the red zone. She got me tagged with the FEMA tags and with the Red Cross tags and gave me a tour, and it was the worst thing I've ever seen. Seeing it on TV and being there is a very different experience. I'll never forget the smell of burning everything. But that actually began an aspect of my ministry that I did not expect to have, which was trauma and disaster ministry. It turned out that there were no liberal religious people down in Ground Zero in any organized way. The Scientologists were there. The Baptists were cleaning houses. A whole bunch of people were doing a whole bunch of things, but there were no Unitarian Universalists anywhere doing this work. And I called Bill Sinkford, who at the time was president, and I said, how come there's no UU group that does disaster work? And he said, I don't know. So I called on my friends who were police chaplains, fire chaplains, everybody. And that following February, we met and started what became the UU Trauma Response Ministry. And we'd always wanted it to be something larger in the way that Episcopalians feed people and folks do other things. But it didn't turn out that way. What it did turn into was a trauma response team for Unitarian Universalist congregations that experience some kind of disaster, whether it's a human disaster like a murder-suicide, or a natural disaster like hurricanes, or some other disaster of some other kind. And we did that and continue to do that. People sort of didn't take it all that seriously until the church in Knoxville was attacked and people were shot. And that's when people realized that there was an actual team of actual Unitarian Universalist ministers that showed up when something happened. For a long time, I was the murder-suicide person because I'd had a run of showing up at places where there had been murder-suicides in the congregation. I was frankly surprised at the number of congregations where people thought it would be okay to shoot folks and then themselves. But we're human like other human beings, and we do things that we shouldn't do, and things happen. But I was gratified that there was an opportunity to help with that. So that was a part of my ministry I did not expect. I did expect that there would be a lot of internal drama and conflict. I had figured that out from my pre-candidating weekend, which was in and of itself a profoundly disruptive weekend. The committee was fighting among themselves. I was refereeing. I went home and told my husband, I said, this is not going to be the easiest place to be. And I had been warned. I had been warned not to come to Fortview. But I wanted to come. I wanted to minister in New York City. And I knew it would be difficult. There are moments that I didn't think it was going to be as difficult as it was, but I was determined that a church with the location that Fourth Universalist had, and with the reach that it could have in New York City, had to be what I always called a beacon of liberal religion on the Upper West Side. And I said that every Sunday for the 13 years that I was there. I mentioned conflict around social justice work. And there was a huge, the biggest conflict and the earliest conflict was that around the animal rights people in the congregation, and the other groups within the congregation that wanted the church to be involved with other kinds of social justice work. At first, I'd hoped we could negotiate something among those groups, but it turned out that there was such a locus of control had been so firmly established within the animal rights group. The only thing that we could do over time was simply to begin another group, to begin working with people who had other interests, and then to limit the amount of disruption that the animal rights group people would be allowed to have in a congregation on any given day. I spent the first 2 years making sure that the pictures of dead monkeys that got posted on the bulletin boards didn't stay on the bulletin boards. And that people who were coming to church who might be wearing a fur coat were not asked to leave, because those things were happening. It took some concerted effort on both my part, the part of the board, the part of the Committee on Ministry, to manage that, and it took several years for that to become manageable. The other part that was challenging, and you've heard that from Darrell, was the building. I learned more about boilers, flame impingement, cracked drainage, and the ADA requirements for doorways and other things than I ever thought that I would learn or know. But it was clear to me that we had to find a way to support this enormous building. And the school that was renting the parish hall at the time was paying roughly $12 a square foot in a community that routinely got somewhere between $30 to $35 a square foot. So the challenge was, how did I get the congregation and the board to help make that transition? Well, we needed help. So we found this fantastic nonprofit consultant group. And it turned out that when I found them, one member had actually come to the church to hear me preach right after 9/11. So he kind of knew the building. That led to several years of really intense work on getting tenants in the parish hall that would improve the parish hall in ways we couldn't afford to do, but that in their staying there made it a better place and a more easily rentable space, um, and to solidify the kinds of leasing that we needed to do there, to supplement the church as a primary revenue stream and a secondary revenue stream around events. Um, and by the time I left, we had secured a rental with a preschool, that basically brought in somewhere upwards of $600,000 a year for about a 10-year period. Um, and that took a lot of doing. I remember very distinctly being on the phone with our lawyers, our consultants, the daycare lawyers, and the daycare consultants, and they were reading through the lines of the lease. And I did it. I think I did it for hours. I felt like my ears were bleeding. And I was in the bedroom and listening to all this. And Bob comes in and he's like, "Are you still on with them?" And I'm like, "It's just going to keep going on." But it was really important to try to secure that. Um, and so I learned the things that I learned at Fort U about doing those kinds of things have really helped me in my work now, at Star King, as we begin to make changes in our own, future, for our own future. Um, what was most challenging for me was helping helping Fort Universalist become a community. It took 2 years to get a behavioral covenant for the church. Um, people, there were a small contingent of people who liked fighting. They just liked it. They enjoyed it way too much for me, and they enjoyed it in a way that I felt made it almost impossible for the church to grow. Because people don't come to church to fight. Most of us don't. We come to church to be renewed. We come to church for rest. We come to church for inspiration. And we join committees and, subcommittees so that we can do the work that we feel called to do in response to the spiritual calling that we've gotten in a congregation. But that was a really tough thing to do. And it took lots of little steps over lots of years, with the help of some lay leaders who were absolutely stalwart in helping with this common goal of creating community. It took a long time, um, but it was a community when I left. A community I think that, um, allowed for the flourishing of so many people, and I was glad to be part of that.